R&B star R. Kelly was found guilty of 9 counts including racketeering and 8 violations of an anti-sex trafficking law in New York. Come next summer, he will face additional charges in Chicago. Welcome back to Inside the Issues. I'm Alex Cohen. The impact of these verdicts have been reverberating throughout the country, including right here in Southern California. For more on this issue, I spoke recently with Nayeli May. She's executive director of a group called Journey Out. They're an LA-based nonprofit which advocates for survivors of sex trafficking. Nayeli May began by sharing her personal reaction upon first hearing of the news that R. Kelly was found guilty.
Honestly, I was not shocked, but I was actually shocked that the conviction went through, and that something finally happened. R. Kelly has been in the news, and he's been talked about around this topic for so long. I was relieved and surprised to finally see something went through. And also, obviously, incredibly disheartened for those victims and survivors that have had to go and endure all of this.
So many of the victims in this circumstance were young Black women. Can you talk a little bit about, does that demographic in this particular circumstance, does that mirror what we see here in Southern California? And if so, what might that mean for Black women here in our area and young women, girls who oftentimes wind up victims of these tragic circumstances?
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, that definitely lines up with the survivors and victims that we serve. Black women and girls are the majority of those that we are serving. And unfortunately, Black girls, 1 in 4 Black girls who are more than likely to be sexually exploited or abused at some point in their lives. So it's unfortunately a reflection of what happens nationally and is what we're seeing in Los Angeles. Absolutely.
And I think people might look at the R. Kelly situation and feel like, okay, well, if this sort of situation is happening, you report it, it goes to court, and then it gets resolved. But it's certainly not as simple as all of that, especially at the very early stages. And can you talk about what it takes for women, young women in these circumstances to even just kind of bring up these allegations, accusations, why they might be reluctant to do so, even if it's not, a very famous musician who's at the heart of it?
Absolutely. So a person is groomed into this situation from a very young age. Like what we learned in this case is that his victims were children, so they were children when this was happening, and they didn't necessarily understand what was happening. So they're groomed into it. So oftentimes it takes a person a long time to truly realize that they are a victim then. So, and when that happens, there's a lot that comes with that, whether it's fear of retaliation, fear for their own lives, or fear for their family. There's a lot of coercion that goes into this. So there's various layers to that. And one of them is definitely, first of all, for that person to realize, hey, I'm a victim. And, that takes a lot of courage and strength to be able to do that. Then it's the fear factor. What will happen afterwards and who will believe me? And there's so much that goes on there.
And Nayeli, from what I've heard too, part of the situation and the courage it takes to really come out and publicly say, I am a victim, has to do with responsibility. And a lot of times victims feeling like, well, I agreed to do this, I agreed to do that. How much am I a victim if I said yes? Is that something that you hear from the people that you work with?
Especially in the beginning. And, that's one of the arguments that you'll kind of hear from others. I will even ask me, well, what if you choose that? But if a person chooses to be in a music video or chooses to be in a relationship with someone or a friendship with someone, that doesn't mean that they're consenting then to be exploited or to be abused. So there are a lot of layers to that. And I think that's the challenging part. And as I mentioned, a person is often groomed, and a lot of those that are victimized are already in maybe a tough situation themselves, where they're lacking a form of support, where they maybe don't have certain adult figures to tell them, hey, this is okay or not okay. Or they're encouraged by peers because they're recruited by someone, more often than not, someone they know. So it's very challenging for them.
And And when we've been talking about victims so far in this conversation, we've been saying, young women, girls, but in the case of R. Kelly, and this is, again, one of those things that I feel like is reflected in our region, it's not just girls and women, it's boys and men too. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. That is definitely something that we don't talk about and we don't recognize fully within the community. We often talk about victims as, women and children, or young girls. But in R. Kelly's case, there were victims that came forward that identify as male that were exploited by him when they were boys. They were just children. So, and the media hasn't been talking about that as much. And I think there's a lot of reasons to that. It's just something that's not necessarily talked about, or that's, almost frowned upon. And you can only imagine, it's already challenging for a victim to come forward, as we discussed, but for a male victim or a young boy to come forward and say something takes a lot of courage.
It does
as
indeed.
well.
Nayeli, I want to preface this by saying I am not a lawyer. I know you're not necessarily a lawyer, but one of the things that really fascinated me about the situation with R. Kelly, as I understand it, one of the things that was really different there was how they legally decided to pursue this case, and using racketeering charges and RICO and the kind of stuff that you usually see in mafia cases used here. It would seem to great success. For you and others who work in this field here in Southern California, is there some sort of a takeaway from this of like, never thought to necessarily do it this way, but maybe we could also look at this as a legal approach and have success where we might not otherwise have it?
I think, if anything, this definitely encourages the importance of communication across cities in different states, for sure. Because a person, when they're exploited, usually that story and situation is not singular. Like, if a person is exploited, or we're working with somebody that's in Los Angeles, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily from Los Angeles. More often, they could be from other cities, other states, other countries. So the cases go way further. And I think if you were to track the history of those that are the perpetrators that are out there, you'll start to see that the cases more often than not are a lot larger than the one person that they may get in trouble for or get caught for exploiting.
Nayeli May is the executive director of the organization Journey Out. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.